Thank you very much, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's forum entitled Affirmative Action, Equal Opportunity, or Reverse Discrimination. I'm Alan Counter, Director of the Harvard Foundation and Associate Professor of Neuroscience at Harvard Medical School, and I've been asked by the Black Students Association to serve as moderator this evening. And my role as moderator is to serve as an objective person and permit our panelists to speak to the issues. Certainly, I must preface my remarks by saying that neither the title nor many of the questions I will pose to the panelists have been formulated by myself. They have been formulated by the students, and particularly the students of BSA. And I'm not here to suggest at all that I even take a position on the title, particularly the reverse discrimination part of that title. As originally conceived and as I understood it as a person coming to Harvard in 1970, affirmative action was a well-intentioned effort to offer opportunities for education, training, and employment to those descendants largely of American slaves who had been unconscionably exploited and shut out of successful American society. Affirmative action now has taken on an entirely different set of connotations, and that's part of what we will be discussing tonight. As our nation's demographics have changed and as women have demanded equal opportunity, the concept of affirmative action requires a number of new discussions and definitions. And this gathering tonight will hopefully enlighten us about that topic, and you will share your views with us in the question and answer period. Our panelists tonight are quite qualified to speak to this topic. They include Mr. Bob Zelnick, a graduate of Cornell University and the University of Virginia Law School. Bob Zelnick has served as ABC News correspondent to the Pentagon, Tel Aviv, and Moscow, as well as ABC News investigative reporter and news director of the Washington Bureau. He has published scholarly articles in journals published in Georgetown University and at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and has received numerous awards for his reporting. Mr. Zelnick is currently serving as a Washington-based correspondent for ABC News and is the author of a book called Backfire, A Reporter's Look at Affirmative Action. He's currently working on a biography of Al Gore. Our next panelist is Mr. Theodore Shaw, who is an associate director, counsel to the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, Incorporated. It's the nation's oldest legal organization fighting for equal rights under the law. He has litigated civil rights cases throughout the country on the trial and appellate levels and in the U.S. Supreme Court. He graduated from Wesleyan University with honors and from Columbia University Law School, where he was a Charles Evans Law Fellow. He is a member of the bar in New York and in California and is also an adjunct professor of law at Columbia Law School. Our next panelist is Mr. Leo Smith, who is CEO of Smith Friday Enterprises. He's vice chair of the California Civil Rights Initiative, former Los Angeles talk show host, and a columnist for Headway magazine. And our final panelist is one of our own professors, distinguished Professor Michael Sandell. He is a professor of government here at our university. He is the author of, most recently, a new book, Democracy's Discontent, America in Search of a Public Philosophy. His publications include Liberalism and the Limits of Justice and Liberalism and Its Critics. He teaches political philosophy here at Harvard, including justice, an undergraduate course that typically enrolls about 800 students. Now, with that being said, I would like to turn the discussion over to our panelists, with the first question presented to me for Mr. Bob Zelnick from the students is, let's see, has affirmative action been a remedy, Mr. Zelnick, or is it simply a matter of opening doors?
Thank you very much, Professor. I appreciate the introduction. As someone who, I think the answer to the question will be evident in the remarks that I have prepared on the subject, and if it's not, then I will deal even more directly with it. As the Pentagon correspondent for 7.5 years, including the period of the Gulf War, I became aware of the truth of the slogan that in war, truth is often the first casualty. I think we can extend that to say that when we're debating matters of public policy where emotions run high, a precision of language, a respect for the plain meaning of words is often the first casualty. And I think nowhere is that more evident than when it comes to the question of affirmative action. When Cal Berkeley routinely admits minority students with a 250 to 300 point SAT deficit compared to whites and Asians who are rejected for admission, it is discriminating. And I don't know exactly where the term reverse discrimination comes from, and I agree that for all intents and purposes it can be dropped for purpose of understanding the issue involved. There's discrimination and there's non-discrimination. When the Department of Defense at the Barksdale Air Force Base shelters 100% of the construction contracts that are let out in a calendar year, and they did it for a couple of years consecutively, let's not be esoteric, let's not mince words about what they're doing. They're discriminating against white male contractors. Now, one can talk about remedy, one can talk about fairness, one can talk about the value of this discrimination, one can argue about righting historic wrongs, but let's agree at what has happened. White male contractors have been barred 100% from participating in those contracts. When the federal government moves to force North Carolina or Georgia or Louisiana or Texas to gerrymander election districts so that there's a near 100% certainty of electing black or other minority candidates, that also is a form of discrimination. And the issue that ought to be debated is whether there is some constitutional or moral justification for it. When a white firefighter in Birmingham, Alabama, who finished 11th on a promotion exam, is denied promotion in favor of the highest finishing black who finished 95th in the same exam, that white fireman is being discriminated against. It may also be true that for a century after the Civil War, that black firefighters had the way completely closed to them in Birmingham, Alabama, just as they did state troopers in Alabama. Again, one may justify it on certain grounds, but let's agree on terms. When the Justice Department contrives a case against Shawmut Bank in Boston, alleging mortgage discrimination in order to compel that bank as part of a consent decree to offer loans on concessional terms, or at least by waiving traditional lending criteria, I think there's an element of discrimination both against the bank shareholders and against non-minority borrowers who will help subsidize the higher default rates by paying higher interest rates on their loans. Now, it's a political truism in this country that people in this day and age, a majority of all races, reject the notion of discrimination when confronted with the question. They reject the notion of race preferences. So an elaborate, and there's very good reason for that. It negates, for one reason, the very principle that fueled and gave power to the civil rights movement of a generation ago, and that's equal protection of the law. In fact, it betrays the promise of the architects of that revolution, that their real goal was equality under the law, was equality in fact. And I think one can quote endlessly from the leaders of the movement, both black and white. It tars with the broad brush of discrimination those against whom these acts are taken, while stigmatizing the intended beneficiaries. It provides minorities with a ready-made excuse for failure. As Glenn Lowry, the professor at Boston University, has said, it involves a certain exhibitionism of non-achievement, because the notion behind it is that without special treatment in the law, or in fact, you wouldn't succeed, you wouldn't be here. And that is a very pernicious notion to build into our institutions. It extends protection to groups with no legitimate claim on special treatment. If one concedes that there is a special moral claim that African Americans have in this country, what is the special moral claim of generations of Hispanic immigrants who no sooner land than are entitled in many jurisdictions to special benefits under the law, special affirmative action benefits? Another reason why people oppose it is that it hasn't worked anywhere. In fact, it's had horrendous consequences in India, in Indonesia, Nigeria, Lebanon, Bosnia, you name it. The notion of building treatment by the law based on the color of one's skin, the ethnic background, is one that has done nothing but provoke misery, riots, civil wars, and centuries of retaliation. I think it also poisons the will for the diverse America of the future. That's one of the arguments that I often hear in favor of affirmative action. We're a diverse country. By the mid part of the next century, there will be a minority of whites in this country. That's all the more reason to discipline special treatment out of the law, not to build it into the law, not to have 20, in some cases 30 different ethnic and racial groups with a special claim. You get to the point where in California, 75% of the population was entitled to special treatment under various affirmative action laws. There's a number of arguments to justify this. Give me a flag as to time, so I don't.
Just 5 minutes now.
5 minutes now? Okay. I'll go 2 more. I have a sense when I'm. I think that there are various arguments that it compensates for past discrimination, slavery, segregation, etc. I think it's a certainly colorable claim. It's one that honest and reasonable people can make. It has been rejected by the courts as a constitutional basis for discrimination in the law. That it compensates or helps get around current discrimination. I know from covering him as a newsman that Mr. Shaw will make that argument, just as my friend and opponent in an earlier debate, Chris Sedley, made. That diversity itself is a value, something that has been held to be a constitutional basis of approaching the issue only in the Bakke case, only under the First Amendment rights of universities to determine the shape and context of their classes. And had the Bakke decision of 1978 been implemented in good faith by every state, I don't think that issue would be as contentious today. I think the problem was that places like the University of California at Berkeley took the Bakke flexibility and drove a truck through it and established a de facto quota system using the Bakke rationale. I think, okay, I will conclude by saying that the most pernicious rationalization of affirmative action has increasingly crept into the argument. I urge you all to be alert for it this evening. It consists of twin pillars. Number one, There's no such thing as valid, standardized, objective criteria. And number two, race itself is the equivalent of merit, whether it's as a student, whether it's as a policeman, whether it's a fireman, whether it's a teacher. Race itself has legitimacy as an indication of merit. And I think if you ponder the implications of that, as it's been applied by less humane societies and as it could be applied by less humane societies in the future, you will see that even for the transient benefits it confers, it's something that we would all be better without. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zelnick. We will now have a presentation by Mr. Theodore Shaw, the Associate Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. Mr. Shaw will address the question posed by the students: was affirmative action supposed to address historical prejudice or contemporary racism? And B, should children of immigrants receive affirmative action? You have 5 minutes to present that eloquently, Mr. Shaw. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I first have to acknowledge, as I did to Mr. Zelnick privately, that I had read parts of his book and disagree with almost everything he had to say. But then I found out he, like I, is from the Bronx, and so I feel more kindly toward him. At least I did before I came out here. There's a whole lot, obviously, that could be said about this subject, and we can only touch the surface of it. Affirmative action is many things, and that's something that often gets lost. There is also good and bad affirmative action. There's affirmative action that's implemented properly, and there's affirmative action that isn't. And some of the people who implement affirmative action improperly are people who really don't understand the issue very well or don't have the best interests of those who are supposed to be the beneficiaries at heart. And I could talk about that at some length, but I won't. Suffice it to say that Hopwood versus the state of Texas is a case in which that was true. The question of whether affirmative action was meant to be a remedy for historical injustices is, or current day racism or discrimination, is really a non-question because it was meant, I think, to be both, and it is properly both. Now, some people say that affirmative action punishes those who are around today and had nothing to do with discrimination in the past, puts them at a disadvantage, and that's because most of the way we structure our society is a zero-sum game in which the competition is generally between minority group members, people of color, and poor white people, for the most part, who are also excluded by many of the practices and policies that are challenged often under the rubric of affirmative action. And that, I think, is tragic, but it is also a recipe for permanent race division unless we address it. Now, I agree with Mr. Zelnick. There's no such thing as a reverse discrimination. The term is a very clever one because it brings up into someone's mind the assumption that the person who is making the charge isn't qualified for the job unless, or rather is qualified for the job and is displaced by a minority or woman who presumptively isn't qualified. On the other hand, when our clients bring discrimination cases on behalf of African Americans or women, you have to prove that you're qualified, and often the presumption is unspoken that you are not. And there's a very clever game that goes on in that respect. So I'm glad we agree on that. Race is obviously America's great dilemma. It always has been. It's our original sin, and it continues to be. And there are those who, within 30 years of the passage of the Civil Rights Act, want to wish it away. Much of the debate is ahistorical, decontextualized. I want to use for an example one area that Mr. Zelnick mentioned, the so-called majority-minority congressional districts. The case, as Mr. Zelnick and another puts it, is that this constitutes, as he said, discrimination, that it guarantees 100% that a minority or a black person will be elected. Well, let's take Louisiana, for example. Louisiana, like most of the southern states, is a state with a deep history of race discrimination that has not yet been completely remedied. Certainly it hasn't been eliminated. And no African American has been elected to Congress from a majority white district in Louisiana since Reconstruction. But not only that, no African American has been elected to statewide office from Louisiana since Reconstruction. Not only that, no African American has been elected to the state legislature from a majority white district. And if left to the majority of white voters in Louisiana, David Duke would have been governor of Louisiana in 1991. Now, 55% of the white voters voted for David Duke. That is what is called racially polarized voting. And as a consequence of racially polarized voting, the Voting Rights Act has said that where there's enough of a black population and where you have polarized voting, there ought to be districts drawn to allow African Americans the opportunity to elect the representatives of their choice. Does it mean that they're going to be black necessarily? No, but they very well might be. And I make no apology for that. The fact is that most black people are represented by white people. Most black people never have a chance to vote for an African American. And so what we're talking about with these districts is integrated Congress. This is how African Americans have been elected to Congress from the South. It is not a permanent remedy. It should not be. And I hope that racially polarized voting is breaking down. I think that that is evidenced somewhat by the re-election of Cynthia McKinney to Congress and some other black Congress people who were elected from majority white districts that were redrawn after their districts were declared unconstitutional. Now, let me just say one other thing in closing for the time being, and that is this. I had an exchange on the radio one day some time ago with Pat Buchanan. Got me on his show, and Pat Buchanan lit into me and said it's unfair, racial discrimination, et cetera. I said, well, wait a minute. Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Buchanan, that today, in the 1990s, to be born white in this country is still unrelated to anything that one has done that is merit, because one was just born, or unrelated to any intellectual difference, unless you believe the stuff of the bell curve. Being white is an advantage, skin color, unearned. And he, interestingly enough, agreed. And I said, if that's right, then it means being born black or being born Latino is, in this country, still a disadvantage at the moment of birth, unrelated to merit or unrelated to anything that relates to the stuff of the bell curve. He said he'd agree with that. Well, if that's right, then doesn't fairness dictate that we need to do something about that? Whatever that is affirmative action. And it should be implemented properly. The question of whether or not we should end affirmative action, to me, is a very simple question. Obviously, we want to end it, but we should end it when being born white no longer means that one has an advantage merely because of skin color. And being born black doesn't mean that one has a disadvantage. And that day has not yet come. I long for it. I would love to be relieved of the burden of race. I think that it must be a marvelous thing to wake up in the morning and go through a day and never have to think about race. Some people tell me they've had the opportunity to do it. I've never done it. I would long for it, but I've never had that opportunity.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shaw. And now we'll address the next question to Mr. Errol Smith, who is the Vice Chair of the California Civil Rights Initiative. And the question we're posing to you is this. Discuss the constitutionality of affirmative action and the legislation. And I'm sure you can do that in about 5 minutes.
Has anybody answered any of the questions that have been posed so far? I haven't heard an answer. I don't know. It's interesting. Anyway, we're evidently in a New York frame of mind tonight because I also am from the Bronx. And that's not going to cut any of you guys any slack. But pleasure to be here today. I, as Vice Chair of the California Civil Rights Initiative, I probably logged, I don't know, probably 50,000 miles over the last 2 years debating this issue from coast to coast. And as I routinely went and spoke before different groups about this, the question that always was posed to me was, why would someone like you be in support of doing away with preferences? And of course, what they really meant when they posed that question to me was, why would someone black be in favor of doing away with not affirmative action, but preferences in particular? And every time that question was posed to me, I always responded with the very same answer. I quoted Dr. King, who once said that, even in the face of bigotry towards Jews, even if my Jewish brethren said, we don't need your help to fight anti-Semitism. King said, I would still take a stand against anti-Semitism because it's wrong, it's unjust, and it's evil. And I decided to take a stand against our nation's racial policies as regards preferences because I believe that they're wrong, that they're unjust, and they're evil. I happen to think that there's something a little bit wrong with the fact that in 1989, there were 2,800 students who had perfect 4.0 GPAs, who were denied access to UC Berkeley, while in that same year, over half of the minority students who were admitted had GPAs of 3.5 or less. I happen to think there's something a little bit wrong with that. I happen to think there's something a little bit wrong with the fact that in that same year, 31% of the minorities who were admitted, under the guise of being disadvantaged, came from families with gross incomes of over $75,000 a year. I happen to think there's something a little bit wrong with that. But the thing that I find most wrong with our nation's current racial policies is the climate that it creates. I speak from the sort of the trenches. I'm not an academic. I'm in the real world. I'm an entrepreneur. I am amazed by what I see going on out there. I pick up the paper. I turn on TV. It seems as though we are irrational on the subject of race. On one hand, we argue that we should judge people by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. And then on the other hand, I see that every significant decision that we're making involves racial bean counting. We distribute contracts on the basis of race. We secure slots at universities on the basis of race. We say that we want our school districts to be integrated, but we want our voting districts to be segregated. I don't understand this. We think that we should not consider race in hiring, but we should consider race in adoption. I don't understand this. I can't reconcile this. Now, granted, I have a very simple mind. Maybe I just don't get it. But it doesn't seem rational to me. It doesn't seem sensible to me, our nation's racial policies. But the thing that disturbs me most about our nation's current racial policies is something that comes out of the fact that I happen to be an American who's black. And what I find when I go out into the marketplace, and what I'm concerned that every African American in this room will face when they go out into the marketplace, notwithstanding the fact that you graduated from Harvard, notwithstanding the fact that you happen to have one lofty degree or another, doesn't make a difference. When you go out into the marketplace, what you are going to find is a lingering presumption of inferiority. What you're going to find is a presumption, a suspicion about your competence that comes from the fact that many people arguing in our behalf have argued that but for these programs, we can't make it. And the greatest tragedy that I see is that we've now engendered an entire generation of African Americans and minorities who really believe this. It's mind-boggling to me. And again, I see this conflict that I can't quite make sense of. I go to some high schools and I hear we have Afrocentric education where we're telling each other that we built the pyramids, that we're the descendants of kings and queens. We say this on one side, and then out of the other side of our mouth we say that, but if we don't have that 300 points, that handicap, we can't make it. In the country that is richest in opportunity, in the country where we have the most freedom than any other country in the world, I can't accept that. And I guess one of the reasons why I can't accept that is because the majority of my clients are people from, Central America, Philippines, Korea. I watch them come here. Many of them can barely speak the language. Many of them know very little about the culture. They don't know how to navigate through our economy, which is why they come to me in the first place. And then I watch in a relatively short period of time as they build businesses, buy homes, establish enterprises, send their kids to college. How can I look at these folk doing this and then go back to, quote, my people and say, well, our situation is a little bit different? I can't do that. I cannot support a policy that has at its foundation, that starts with the premise that I am inferior. I can't support that. I will not support that. I will not run around the country telling that to another generation of African Americans. I will not do it. In my opinion, and again, I've been all over the place talking about this. I've heard all the points that have been made on this. I've heard the debate from the left. I've heard the debate from the right. In my opinion, this issue ultimately comes down to two simple questions. Question one is, what kind of a nation do we want to create? And question two is, what kind of a nation are we actually creating? I stand before you today and I challenge anyone in this room to tell me that if we don't do anything, we don't change a thing, that one day we're going to wake up and find that we're now living in a country where we're judging people by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. If you believe that we're on that path, then no, don't change a thing. But I believe that if you're honest, if you look around at what's going on in our country today, I'm from Los Angeles. It's the hotbed of racial enmity, of racial conflict. As I turn on my TV, as I walk the streets, as I pick up the paper, what I see is that we are slipping deeper and deeper into a morass of color-coded opportunity, into greater balkanization, and I'm concerned about that because I have a little daughter. She's about 2 years old. And I believe that I was sent here in part to be a steward. And I don't think that we've been very good stewards. And I see that we're on a course towards balkanization, that unless we begin to elevate, as we once did in this country, the notion that we're all Americans, this notion of e pluribus unum, that I don't know what happened to it in my generation. When I was young, that was the sort of conventional wisdom. That's what we were striving toward. Now we're celebrating our differences. We're doing a wonderful job of celebrating our differences, but I'll bet you that if I were to ask the average person in this room today, what does it mean to be an American? I suspect if you could tell me. You could tell me what it means to be an African American. You can tell me what it means to be an Asian American. You could tell me what it means to be a Hispanic American, perhaps. But I challenge you to tell me what it means to be an American. We've lost that, and that's a problem. Anyway, thank you, and I'll respond to any questions that come after. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Thank you. Now we have the privilege of hearing from one of our own professors of government, Professor Michael Sandell, a very distinguished writer, and as we said earlier, who actually lectures to a course of some 800 students in the area of justice. And one of the questions posed by the students, Professor Sandell, is affirmative action just? Professor Sandell, you have... Professor Sandell, you have 20 minutes.
If he's not from the Bronx, I'm not sure he ought to be here.
I'm not from the Bronx. Is that why I got longer than they did? I'd like to speak, I'd really like to pose some questions to the critics of affirmative action, but in the course of posing those questions, or before posing them, I would like to speak in praise of discrimination, or at least in qualified praise of discrimination. Mr. Zelnick said we may agree or disagree about the moral and constitutional justification, but let's be clear about terms, about words. Discrimination is discrimination. And that's right. Counting race as a factor in admissions or hiring is a form of discrimination. That doesn't decide the question. The question is whether discrimination of that kind in that setting for those purposes is just or not. When Harvard decides to give an advantage to applicants who have high SAT scores for admission, that's discrimination too. It's discriminating according to certain characteristics that Harvard thinks are relevant to its mission. Or when Berkeley discriminates on the basis of grade point averages, that's discrimination. Some people benefit from that, and others don't benefit from it. Whether discrimination on those grounds, grade point average, SAT scores, for those purposes is just or not, depends on our view about the moral importance of the purposes and whether that particular form of discrimination will serve those purposes. Now, you may say, or the critics may say, but there's a difference. Grade point average and SAT scores, those are measures of merit. Whereas race isn't a matter of merit, that's just a matter of how you were born, who you happen to be. That's the moral difference. That's what makes one kind of discrimination illegitimate, and the other, the one based on merit, well, discrimination based on merit, that isn't really even discrimination, is it? That's what the critics would say. But let's take a case that's neither one nor the other exactly. for many years, put race aside, for many years, before even the term affirmative action came into vogue, Harvard, in its admissions policy, didn't just choose the people who came out highest on the SAT test, because they found that to have a national student body, it was necessary to give special attention to students who might come from the West, from California, or from Iowa, or from Kansas, not just from New York and Massachusetts. Now, when they gave an edge in admissions, the students who came from out west, or from Alaska, was that discrimination? It was discrimination. Was it just discrimination? Well, that depends on what you think about the relevance of that principle of choice, geography, geographical diversity, to the purpose of putting together a student body of a national character and flavor and outlook, and how important that purpose is in the education of undergraduates that go to school with people who come from the West, from small towns as well as from big cities, as well as, say, from Massachusetts. That has nothing to do with race. It's not a matter of merit that someone comes from Iowa rather than from Massachusetts. Is it unjust discrimination that they get an edge in admissions? Only if you think that the purpose, building a national student body that will bring a range of perspectives, is morally unimportant or irrelevant to what an undergraduate college is all about. But if you think it is relevant, then you think that discrimination, you must think that that discrimination is reasonable or just or legitimate. It's not a matter of merit. It's not the doing of the person that they came from Iowa rather than New York. And it seems to me the same argument can be made in thinking about the racial and ethnic composition of a student body, in thinking about the diversity of with respect to gender of a student body. The argument in all of these cases, the argument for any particular discrimination, for football players, for piano players, for scholars, for classicists, for scientists, there are a range of purposes that universities serve, and we could talk about other institutions of society too when we talk about jobs and contracts and the like. And the arguments may be different, and the grounds for discriminations may be different. But we're talking in all of these cases about discriminations, and the question we have to ask is, which discriminations are relevant to the purposes, the proper purposes of a university, an undergraduate student body, a workforce, a police department? And race isn't unique in that respect. It's one among a range of considerations. Now, then we have to come to the question, well, all right, take an institution, take an undergraduate college. Is racial diversity important to the purposes of a college? It seems to me the answer to that is yes. If you think that one of the purposes of a college is to educate, to contribute to a society that serves civic purposes, where people from different walks of life, people from different racial and ethnic groups can take up positions of leadership in a society, if that's one of the purposes of a college, then it matters. It matters what the racial and ethnic and gender composition and geographical composition of a college is. And it matters not because it's required for fairness to individuals who come. It's not for the sake of compensating for disadvantage, which may or may not be there among the blacks or Hispanics or people from Iowa. It's not because they deserve it. They deserve an edge. It's not a compensatory argument. It's an argument in the name of the purposes, the social and moral and political purposes that a college or university serve. So you can dispute the purposes. You can say, no, a university should be about scholarship and scholarship alone, in which case you get the best measure of that, and that's all that should count. But once you accept that there may be a range of civic as well as scholarly purposes to, say, a college or university, then you have to allow that other principles of selection, other principles of discrimination are justified. Now, what about the stigmatization argument? What about the presumption of inferiority that Mr. Smith talked about? That is a serious moral cost if that's an effect of affirmative action. But the question is, to what extent is that, as a matter of actual social fact, the result? Is inferiority the necessary premise of affirmative action? Not if you accept the account of the social purposes of a university that I've described, because according to that account, even those who are admitted according to SAT scores aren't morally deserving of admission. They just happen to have qualities that fit with the social purpose of the university. Even people who come from Iowa and get an edge, or who are the children of alumni and get an edge in admissions, they don't get it because they're morally deserving. And the students who have an advantage because of reasons of ethnicity or race or geography or football skills or playing the piano well or being a concert violinist, they don't get the edge because they're more morally deserving. No one does. The way we need to view admissions criteria should induce a certain amount of humility, that none of us gets an edge because we're morally deserving or worthy of compensation for something, but because we happen to have the combination of qualities and attributes that will serve the mission, the moral and social purposes of the institution. What that really suggests, and I would just say this in conclusion, the way to combat the presumption of inferiority is to appreciate that sort of humbling idea that admission, say, to a college or a university is not a reward for merit or desert. It's an office. It's a responsibility. It's like a public office to be discharged, to be exercised, to be carried out. And whether any of us will have deserved to be admitted for whatever reason, for whatever promise, can only be decided later when we can see whether and in what ways we have actually contributed to the social, to the moral, to the political, to the scholarly, and also to the civic mission and purposes of, in this case, a college or a university. So that's my case, my qualified case in favor of discrimination.
Thank you, Professor Sandell. Now, you've heard the positions of each of our panelists, and now we would like to have you participate in this discussion. You may come to the microphones to ask questions, and let me appeal to you. We know that we have many distinguished scholars here at Harvard who enjoy making speeches, but tonight we want you to ask questions. We have brought in all of these wonderful panelists to give the talk. So please, if you could present a question, we'll have the panelists answer. You may direct it at one or the other panelists, and you may, each of you, have a comment on that, but please keep it short. Thank you. The first question from this microphone.
I'm Chandra. I'm a sophomore at Harvard. I just have a quick question for Mr. Smith. I'm going to paraphrase you. You said something to the effect that when you were young, you lived in a place where people weren't so concerned about issues of color. And I just want to know, how old are you and where you lived?
I'm not sure I said exactly that. I'm 40, and again, I was raised in the Bronx, in New York City.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for identifying yourself. Please identify yourself before your question. The next question from this gentleman.
Yes, my name is Stanley Kurtz. I teach in social studies here at Harvard. I have a question for Professor Sandell. Professor Sandell, in view of your position that affirmative action is not, or at least need not be stigmatizing, what would you say to the public release of data on admission statistics? We all know the story about the gentleman who released some data without authorization and was booted out of one law school or another. If it's really true that we can reach a position that says affirmative action is not and should not be stigmatizing, then data on the scores of various classes, be it from Iowa, race, whatever, ought to be able to be released. But it seems to me that the fact that we don't release them is a kind of implicit acknowledgement of the stigmatization argument, and again raises a critical difference, say, between the degree of break that's being given to someone on the basis of geographic region versus race or whatever.
It would depend why the data would be important. I can imagine it might be important if there were patterns and if there were reasonable confidence that the tests or the scores were a measure of academic achievement.
How can we make a public judgment unless we have the data? How can we have the conversation that we're trying to have now unless we have the data? I mean, that seems to be fundamental.
Well, what do you want to know from, what is it that you would draw from the data?
What are the criteria that are causing special consideration to be given, and what degree of divergence between categories are there, so we can make an assessment of the legitimacy of the criteria and whether that suffices to override the degree of difference between the categories? How can we have a public debate and discussion about that? Not to mention the fact that the mere release of the data would, in a sense, have the effect of saying, okay, this isn't stigmatizing. We buy Professor Sandell's way of looking at this.
Whether it would be stigmatizing in practice would depend on whether people attributed some merit or virtue or desert to having a high test score. And my argument is that we should combat that assumption, because I think that assumption is ill-founded.
But to really combat it, mustn't we combat it honestly and openly with the data and then have a public debate about it that's based on what's really happening?
But then the relevant debate would be how to look at the test and say, is this test, to what extent is it a good measure of someone's ability to contribute to this aspect of the university's purpose?
Right, that would be the debate.
But for that debate, I'm not sure that the data broken down by race would be all that relevant.
If degree comes into it, then it would be very relevant, it seems to me. But anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you. The next question will come from the lady standing here at the...
Thank you. My name is Lisa Maria Cabrera. I'm an undergraduate here at Harvard, and my question is open to the panel. I was wondering, assuming that affirmative action is indeed unjust, what other viable alternatives can be offered in order to compensate for these unfair disadvantages faced by certain minority groups in the country? And this is acknowledging that these disadvantages do in fact exist.
I'd like to respond to that. A couple of things. First of all, I think it's important to make a distinction between affirmative action and preferences. Most people that I know are in favor of good affirmative action, just like you have good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. You sort of have good affirmative action and bad affirmative action. I think you made that point as well. If by affirmative action you mean ensuring that everyone has an equal opportunity, that's a good thing. If by affirmative action you mean punishing discrimination where it's found on a case-by-case basis, that's a good thing. But when you do get into that arena where you are now lowering standards and gerrymandering districts in order to ensure an outcome, that's the kind of thing that many Americans are beginning to take a second look at. Now, what I found interesting was that at UC Berkeley, when the regents decided that they were going to do away with the admissions board ability to grant admission on the basis of race or gender considerations, that within 60 days, the board came up with what they call the Berkeley Plan. And it was a race, gender-neutral approach to ensure that there would be equal opportunity and that diversity would continue. My question is, if it was possible to create such a plan, why wasn't it created before? The answer that I believe is that there was no incentive to do it. And that only once we could no longer rely on race and gender preferences did we begin to think creatively about how we could achieve exactly what you're talking about. One idea that's been floated, which I think is very viable, is the idea of simply looking at disadvantage and acknowledging that if someone is economically disadvantaged or comes from an area that where their education and somehow disadvantages them, then perhaps we should give them special attention and special consideration based on that. But again, that's not race, that's economic, and that's completely consistent with our ideals as a nation.
I'd like to comment on that, and at a later point perhaps deal with Professor Sandell's comments. But I think there are two things that ought to be kept in mind. Number one, this society has a broad range of problems, and there's no single answer that can satisfy you or me or anyone else as a substitute for the kinds of affirmative action that I oppose and that some others oppose. There are ways to compensate for set-asides in the construction industry. I dealt with some of them in my book. There are ways to address educational deficiencies. There are ways to address employment discrimination. But there's not one ready-made solution to substitute for all forms of affirmative action, which in fact don't need a substitute because most of them don't work very well, if at all. Second of all, one of the great benefits of doing away with legislated or administrated race preferences would be that this society could focus in very hard terms on what the problem is. The problem basically at this point in time is not that you are going to graduate from Harvard and face discrimination in this world. The problem is with the black underclass, essentially, in most of the urban centers of this country, where you have a kid who is in all likelihood suffering from bad prenatal care, comes into this world 75 or 80% of the time with a single mother, grows up in an environment of drugs and crime, and has probably had involvement with the criminal justice system as a juvenile and a young adult. Take that kid and goes to a school which is a custodial institution. That kid at 16 or 18 years old is not going to be helped by affirmative action. Not in your lifetime, not in mine, and not in his or hers. And if we focus on where the problem is, maybe we'll come up with some solution.
I think Mr. Shaw, you want to say?
Well, I did. I just want to point out that there are a lot of things that affirmative action isn't going to do. It isn't going to cure all the problems in the world, and no one says that it is supposed to. So those last comments, although they, I think, acknowledge a serious set of problems that exist, I think are misdirected if they're directed at affirmative action. Now, I have to keep coming back to this point because I hope that somehow I can get this across. When we talk about gerrymandered districts, anyone who is familiar with the political process, I defy you to show me one congressional district, state legislative district, or city council district that is not gerrymandered somehow. If you think that these districts are created out of thin air, or that they fall into neat circles and squares, then you're not familiar with the political process. Now, the point I keep making, or trying to make, is that we decontextualize this discussion. And I want to reiterate that the districts that are being challenged are temporary remedies. The one that was at issue in the first Supreme Court case was a 53% black district, 47% white. And yet, those in the Supreme Court and our opponents talked about them as, quote, segregated districts, compared them with racial apartheid. Now, you know, the facts mean something. Let's find out what they are. I want to go back to then the question. I'm not sure what the substitute would be. I am in favor of what could be called, for lack of a better term, affirmative action on the basis of class or economic status. But this country, I don't think is really ready for that. Most of the people who have been attacking race-based affirmative action in Congress and in other areas are people who are not lifting a finger to do anything about the war that's being fought on poor people regardless of race. And I don't think that they're really honest, for the most part, in their discussion of this issue, if they're talking about a transformative effort that would truly open up our educational institutions to people from all backgrounds, regardless of economic status. the pressures on these institutions, particularly the elite institutions like Harvard, economically are so great that the money isn't simply there to support that kind of affirmative action effort based on class. I do think we should look at people's background, and I certainly would look at a privileged African American, economically privileged, differently than I would at an African American student who comes from a poor family. I certainly would look at that differently. All that drives toward, though, to me, is individualized consideration in the admissions process, and the crunch of the admissions process is such that admissions offices are compelled, they think, to do things by the numbers, and that's why we end up with the problems that we do in admissions in large part. Finally, it is ludicrous to think that what one does on one Saturday morning on a standardized test, one day out of somebody's life in high school, is going to be a definition of their merit and their worth and their abilities that will follow them for the rest of their lives. Test scores, test scores may tell us something. I'm not trying to throw them out. They may tell us something about people's ability to do something, but we load way too much into these test scores, and they don't do what they are thought to do. So we need to rethink merit and how we measure it.
Did you want to say anything else on that? Okay, very good. Thank you. Then we'll go to the next question of this gentleman here.
My name is Eric Columbus. I'm a student at the law school here. And my question was somewhat answered by Mr. Smith and Mr. Shaw in their remarks. I was wondering about class-based affirmative action, and I'll pose it in the starkest form. What would the panelists think about mainly admissions and, to a certain extent, hiring, instituting a system that would completely remove race from the affirmative action calculus and instead focus on issues of class broadly defined, such as income and wealth, school system, single-parent versus two-parent homes, neighborhood issues like that?
You could end up with virtually all white institutions that have affirmative action on the basis of class, and it certainly would be fair for lower income white people, but proportionally, although African Americans or Latinos may be poorer, are poorer in this country, overall in numbers, there are many more poor white people. And if you didn't have any ability to take into consideration racial diversity, you could end up with virtually all white institutions. I think without some effort to be conscious of diversity, that very well could happen if we're not careful about it. But I certainly think we ought to be engaging in those kinds of efforts for reasons unrelated to achieving race diversity, and it may bring us some more in the way of racial diversity, but it may be marginal.
I say it again, if I can. I say it again, and I don't know, perhaps again I have a simple mind here, but what I hear implying, what Mr. Shah is saying, is that if we had a single standard, whatever that standard happens to be, that somehow African Americans would not be able to make it. Because he's saying that if we have that single standard, that somehow all of our universities would become white. Are you saying that if we set a standard, and it's a very high standard, that I wouldn't make it and many of the other African Americans in this room, once understanding that the bar has now been raised, that there's nothing that we would be able to do to attain that standard? I can't support that. I can't agree with that.
Well, you may put more into the standard than I do, but let me personalize it in the sense of saying this. I think, and I may be wrong, but I think that were it not for affirmative action, I would have gone to Wesleyan University and Columbia University. I don't feel stigmatized by that one bit. The fact is,
maybe we'll have Mr. Zelnick and Professor Sandell say something to that.
well, can I finish?
Okay, we're going to try to keep, because we have so many wonderful questions. If we
I
keep it
understand.
brief.
The fact is that once in, I had to perform. And when I got out of law school, I had to pass the bar exam. And at some point, I had to be judged on how good a lawyer I am. And at the end of the day, when I get on an airplane, I don't care what a pilot's SAT score was. I want to know how good a pilot he was. That's the way it is.
Mr. Zelnick?
That pilot had to pass some objective tests also. But I have two comments. First of all, on the notion of racial gerrymandering. It's no accident that Mr. Shaw's greatest ally in the days when racial gerrymandering was unchecked by Supreme Court decision, was the right wing of the Republican Party, because they recognized right off the bat that if you siphon off black Democrats from 2 or 3 surrounding districts, you make those districts whiter, more conservative, and more likely to elect Republicans. And lo and behold, according to the best studies that I'm familiar with, that's exactly what happened. Not on a massive scale. The best studies that I've seen on it show that approximately 8 to 11 additional Republicans were elected to the House of Representatives in the South due to this racial gerrymandering that set up the majority-minority districts. Now, 11 Republican seats was not decisive in the 104th Congress. It was in the 105th, and I would submit that the Black Congressional Caucus would have been a lot better off as part of a Democratic majority than they are as part of a vocal Democratic minority. Second of all, I really don't want to let too much time go by before responding to Professor Sandell. Race is not just another category in this country, like playing the tuba or being a good golfer or being from the state of Iowa. This country did not fight a civil war and undertake Reconstruction and go through a civil rights movement because boys from Iowa or Wyoming or Idaho were enslaved and discriminated against. Race is a suspect constitutional category. It has been since at least since the Warren era and before that, for a very good reason, because it poisons the body politic. It poisons the way this society operates, and the more recognition officially it receives, the worse off for this society and any other society that's tried it.
Mr. Sandell, would you like to make some comments on it?
I would. I agree with the first half of what Mr. Zelnick said, that race isn't just another category like playing the tuba or coming from Iowa. I think that's why I think it's more important than playing the tuba or coming from Iowa to have a racially diverse student body, and than to have one that reflects geographical ability or the ability of some students to play the tuba well, precisely because of the importance, the centrality of race as a factor in American social and political and civic life. I have also a question for Mr. Smith. If he maintains that SAT scores and GPAs and the like are true objective measures of merit, and that those measures of merit give rise to a right to be admitted, then why give an edge to poor folks? Why say that you would allow economic class to count? Why give an edge to a kid from a poor background who has a lower SAT score than some kid from Beverly Hills with a high SAT score?
Do I get a chance to respond to that? Good. First of all, I'm not arguing. I'm not arguing in favor of giving people who are perhaps stuck in the inner city automatic admission to Harvard or any other outstanding Ivy League school. What I am saying is that we should embark upon some kind of a program to ensure that they get better education. That's what I am saying. However, I do need to go back and just very quickly touch on this because we're being disingenuous. I am told that the most corrosive, the most debilitating remnant of segregation is this perception of black inferiority. I see evidence that as African Americans, we on a daily basis are struggling to deal with our own acceptance and belief that we are inferior. I see how hard we work to constantly make a public statement to the world that I am equal, I am a man, I am just as good as everyone else. To argue that, or to claim that when you get on a plane, you don't care, or to claim that you don't feel stigmatized, I find that very difficult to believe in light of the fact that I observe that we're very sensitive to even the slightest slight, to even the remotest innuendo that we are not as good. If you want to see an African American go off quickly, all you have to do is imply lightly that you're not as good. Now, that does not strike me as the behavior of someone or group that is secure with who they are. Now, my belief, and again, I'm an entrepreneur, I believe that competition is good. I believe that the only way that we can purge ourselves of this stigmatization is to compete. See, no one looks at Michael Jordan and says, you know, I don't know how you got there. I don't think you have a right to be there, because they know that through competition, he is where he is and he deserves it. Now, my belief is that if there were no doubt that the only way you got into this school is through competition, then no one could question you. No one could take that away from you. No one could challenge you. That's what's real to me. So again, this notion that the stigmatization doesn't matter, it doesn't resonate with me.
Well, let me just say thank you. We have 11 additional questions, or now 10. I would like to try to accommodate all of the students. If we could just make brief remarks to the questions, and I think we can get every question in. This lady's next.
Hi, my name's Allison Ford. I'm a freshman at Harvard University, and my question is for the whole panel, but particularly for Mr. Shaw and Professor Sandell. When affirmative action was started, it was started with the dual noble goals of ensuring equality for all and moving our society towards a society which is colorblind, which was not then and is not now. And my question is, if you think that affirmative action as it stands now, where it particularly looks towards race, can accomplish this goal and can move our society towards colorblindness.
I'm glad you asked that question. I think that the language of colorblindness is unfortunate, but I understand it. I think that it came from the dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson, Justice Harlan's dissent, in which, for his time, although he certainly believed in white superiority, he was fairly courageous. But the natural, it seemed, antidote to race discrimination was color blindness. But the real problem wasn't color consciousness. The real problem was the notion of white superiority, white supremacy. I think that the problem isn't whether or not we see color or race, any more than there's a question about whether we see gender or anything else that happens to be connected with our physical appearance. The question is, what is its significance? How do we treat one another? Is it a ground for exclusion or inclusion? I don't believe we are ever going to have a society which is not color conscious in one level or another. That is, color blind in the sense that we don't see color. It would be unnatural not to see it. But that doesn't mean that we use it as a basis for division and discrimination and setting up one group as superior to the other. I think that's what's important.
Okay, someone else you want to address that to, you said?
Sandell would like to address
Okay.
Well, I would just say briefly, reply with a question. There is an ideal. It's an ideal of assimilation, a universalist ideal that says at the end of the day, the best state of affairs would be if you didn't even notice, weren't even aware of the race of your roommate, the religion of your roommate, the gender of your roommate. Well, maybe that would be but would. But there is an assimilationist ideal that would be the ideal. If we didn't notice, if we weren't aware of these differences, if we just saw human beings as human beings directly and abstracted from all these categories that complicate life, or is that the ideal? It seems to me it's worth considering that wouldn't be the ideal, that in the best state of affairs, these would not be the grounds for invidious discrimination and prejudice and hatred, but they would persist, these differences of geography, of ethnicity, of race, of religion, as sources of interest and ways of learning and engaging and arousing the moral curiosity of persons as roommates and as fellow citizens. And that is not a colorblind vision, if you accept that picture as the condition to be aimed at.
It seems to me that that we don't have to guess about this, that all we have to do is look around the world and we can see the nations where there are where there's a high level of concentration of focus on differences. And what we see is warring, what we see is disharmony, what we see is brutality that is abominable and unconscionable. What we can also look to is what occurred in this country around the turn of the century. And I'm just barely old enough to remember when Irish sort of looked at Germans, and I'm Irish and you're German. There was a huge distinction there. And there were Jews and there were Italians. And now it's interesting to me because routinely now we sort of talk about African Americans, Latinos, Asians, and whites. We don't say Germans. We don't say Irish. Now, do these people lose their heritage? I don't think so. But somehow, through the belief or focus on a common set of ideals, on a common national identity, we were able to harmonize these disparate groups and build a nation. That worked. I observed it to work. On the other hand, this notion of focusing on our differences, I haven't seen it work anywhere. If you have, I'd like to hear about it.
Okay. We'll take the next question here, please.
Hi, my name is Chris Kwok. I'm a senior at Harvard College, and I have a few quick questions, starting with Mr. Shaw. The first question is, and speaking of Mr. Buchanan, you asked him whether being born black was advantageous or being born white was being advantageous in the United States, and his response was no. And my question for you is also being born good-looking or tall is obviously an advantage in the United States economically and politically. What you have to say about that? The next question is for Mr. Zelnick. Really quickly.
Can I ask you, in fairness to the other students, just take that one,
But
if you don't
I
mind.
have to ask Mr. Zelnick this one. Because if you were at Harvard, you'd probably be writing for the Peninsula. And my question is, if you were here at Harvard and you were talking about admissions policies, you would be, you're railing against race discrimination or preferences. But what about legacies and alumni who obviously had advantages? And I don't know, maybe it's because race is easier and sexier to deal with. And maybe if you could comment.
Could
on
I ask, please, for about 60-second answers so we can get the other students in?
Sure, I certainly agree that there's an advantage to being born good-looking, and most of us don't have it. I'm not sure what that has to do with the point I was making, though. The point I was making is that I believe, and I think all the indicia and everything we know, and apparently Mr. Buchanan didn't disagree. He agreed that to be born white in this society for reasons unrelated to merit is still an advantage. I think anybody who's honest has to admit that. I refer you to Andrew Hacker's book, I think it's Two Nations, in which he does this experiment of asking his white students what would it cost them to be compensated if they woke up and suddenly found themselves black one day, and they all think they agreed around $1 million. Jesus. That said worlds, I think. But the other, well, I'll stop there. I think race is different, and this is the main point. Certainly race is different, and I think we've all agreed on that. Being born white does. Yeah, I think it still does. Yeah, and being born good-looking shouldn't, and neither should being born white.
Okay, Mr. Zelnick?
If I were on the admissions panel at Harvard University, there are three things that I would do in the following orders of priority. Number one, I would admit my daughter Marnie, who is an applicant right now. For early admission, she was deferred, so she's still in the pool. Terrific kid. But not a legatee, I might add. Number two, I would probably, without knowing the specifics, but in principle, I would at most colleges, I would put a little bit less weight on legacies, although I am not aware of academic problems centered about legacies. I'm not aware that legacies particularly require remedial courses, as have been the case with minorities, not at Harvard, but at some of the other schools. Third of all, at Harvard as a private university, I would probably pay some attention to race. But I don't think that if something is worth doing, it's worth doing to excess. I think if you have a gap of 50 or 75 or 90 points in SATs, it's one thing. If you have a class of people at a university that are 275 to 300 points below the others, I think you are creating a problem
by paying that much attention to race. I hope that answers your question.
Mr. Zelnick, in light of your comments, I might inform you that I see the senior admissions officer for Harvard, Mr. David Evans, here, just across. Your question, please.
How does your daughter do on the tuba, by the way?
Never played in her life, but she's varsity lacrosse and field hockey. Monty, would you stand up and say hello to Mr.
Your question, please.
My name is Ileana Kujemko. I'm a freshman at the college, and my question is for Professor Sandell. I agree with affirmative action, but I often think it's difficult to make the argument in the job market. And I really agree with your arguments that there's an intrinsic good to having a diverse student body, but I wonder if you can really apply those arguments that there's a civic and political and social responsibility to like a police department or a fire department when their goal is to put out fires, not perhaps have a social or nature.
No, it's a good question, and I think that the case and the weight to be assigned to different factors would vary depending on the setting. But police officers have to put out fires that have to do with human beings and their interactions and the way they understand one another and the way they relate to authority figures. So I think the case for counting race as a factor, not the only factor, in hiring police officers is actually quite weighty. In the case of firefighters, probably less weighty for exactly the kinds of reasons you suggest. But I think the case would vary from case to case depending on the purpose of the institution or the group.
May I make a very brief
Please.
I have studied the recruiting practices of various police departments and some of the litigation in the area. And I think up to a point, I mean, you would want a certain number of minorities in order, number one, to relate to the minority community, number two, to get information, number three, to be an ambassador so that the minority communities don't feel they're dealing with a bunch of racist cops, and so that they're not dealing with a bunch of racist cops. But for the life of me, I cannot understand why you can't get minority cops through intelligent recruiting. Go to historically black colleges and universities or other places that have perfectly qualified black students and young people, graduates of the military, and the best police forces in the country are doing precisely that. And they're doing it without playing around with objective standards of merits. There's nothing in the world wrong with doing that.
The next question, please.
My name is Brian. I'm a freshman here. I have a question for everybody. Everybody answer, please. To what degree should we take into account for this government and for this university the pragmatic consequences of an affirmative action policy? I know Mr. Zelnick was speaking about retaliation as something that occurs, and obviously we're all having this very heated debate across the country. If white people and other majorities perceive affirmative action as quote-unquote reverse discrimination or a policy which is only there to help up otherwise inferior minorities, then to what degree should we go along with what Professor Sandell says, which is what is just, what is moral, and to what degree should we just look at what works and what creates equal opportunity, which is the goal?
Is there any person who'd like to address that directly, or? Okay.
Well, I take it by default more than anything else. In my opinion, due largely to Supreme Court and lower court decisions in the area, most forms of race preferences are at a dead end right now. I think in terms of congressional districting, even in the absence of Supreme Court decisions, you basically run out of congressional districts that can be created with majority-minority constituencies. So I think it would be wholesome from a variety of perspectives if we turned our attention to things, A, that are less divisive, number two, offer a promise for that segment of the community that really needs help and that we must achieve breakthroughs with in order to achieve a better, more just society. And three, that we put an end to practices which are constitutionally suspect at best.
So, Professor Sandell, would you I mean, would you say that we should just go on right ahead without the pragmatic consequences and put these people in offices in universities, as you said, like for moral reasons rather than taking into account what the reaction of other members of society are?
I think we should take account of the effects of the policy, and if there's a lot of resentment, that should matter to policy. And it can matter in a lot of ways, and one of them can be it can point out the need to make the case more convincingly, to make the moral arguments more powerfully than perhaps they have been made. And in other cases, and contract set-asides may be one of them, if the effect is to create a cynical system where a group of people in a business will just set up a front and bring in a group put some minorities on a board of a company and take advantage of federal contract set-asides, if in practice that is the predominant effect, then that would be a reason to change that policy in that area. But that needn't condemn the idea of striving to include members of different racial and ethnic backgrounds in the common life of the nation. But the practical effect of policies should matter.
Now, I've been instructed by the John F. Kennedy School that we must terminate this discussion at precisely 8:30. We are just about there, but I'm going to take a few more questions, so please be understanding.
My name is Helen Thomas Castillo, and I'm a sophomore at Harvard College, and I have a question for Mr. Smith. You've made the point over and over that this stigmatization that's going along with race and inferiority is stemming from affirmative action or affirmative action policies. And I want to know on what evidence are you basing this, and if so, if you really believe this, why has it continued from the 40s and 50s on into today?
I'll just give you two examples. We've heard already about the disparity between the average SAT scores of, say, Asians, of white Americans, in comparison to African Americans, Hispanics. That's one example. One that particularly concerns me, I'm a pilot, and I recall during the mid-'80s that under the guise of diversity, Northwest Airlines had a program in place to get more African Americans and other minorities in the cockpit, and that they were lowering the number of hours required to get into the cockpit by 10,000 hours. Now, in my viewpoint, public safety is much more important than diversity. And when I discovered that, I was appalled.
So would I.
I would be too. That's not the point. But do you really think that eliminating affirmative action programs will indeed eliminate the stigmatization that has gone along with the inferiority that is associated with African Americans or Latino Americans or anything else? I don't think so.
Well, first of
is
all,
my
again,
point.
let me make the distinction. I am not against affirmative action. I said that before, I'll say it again.
I heard.
We're talking about preferences. We're talking about lowering standards. We're talking about having double standards. I don't believe that we can ever create the kind of environment where we're going to get respect and be treated equally in fact, as long as it is common knowledge that we have different standards for qualification. So in the simple answer to your question is yes. I do believe that if we set a single standard, make the standard whatever you believe is a genuine measure of merit, but have a single standard, and then make sure that every American is capable of competing by ensuring that we all get a good foundation, good education, etc., and then encourage us to compete. When that happens, my experience is that when Americans believe that you are where you are as a result of your hard work and that you earned it and that there was merit there, there's no resentment. That's been my experience. So I do believe that is.
I see Mr. Sharp edging toward this, but okay, very quickly.
Very quickly. I think this is an important point. There's a big difference between lowering the qualifications with respect to the number of pilot hours required, which is experience, hands-on experience, and a paper and pencil standardized exam. And this is the kind of distinction that I think that we need to keep our minds on when we talk about how affirmative action can be implemented in ways that are poorly implemented, and some ways that may be okay. So that's an important distinction. And of course, I think the point that the young woman was making just now is a point that I've been thinking about, and it goes to the question this young man asked before. The problem with stigmatization didn't start with affirmative action, and it's not going to end with affirmative action either.
Okay, sir, your question?
My name is Chile Ebo Suji. I'm a lawyer from Toronto. I'm in tomorrow's panel. Mr. Smith, you said something that I think is very revealing. You said that one of the things you can do to an African American to get him roiling is to suggest that he's not qualified like everybody else now. Why do people have to blow up if you make that suggestion? Have you ever thought about the implications of that in terms of perhaps this might be someone under stress? And if this person is under stress, that may account for why he or she may be likely to score less than somebody else. Mr. Shaw said he grew up thinking about race all the time. Does it not tell you that while somebody is busy thinking about race all the time, somebody else is busy working on the SAT score?
I see it a little differently. I think it's a reasonable question, but I see it a little bit differently. I think that the perception of inferiority is something that we have internalized from tens of years of being told that we are in fact inferior. And we've accepted it. We believe it. We say we don't believe it, but we believe it. And I think that, more than anything else, triggers the reaction. I appreciate what Mr. Shah is saying about the fact that it's a burden that at times your racial realities are shoved into your face, but I don't think about race all the time. I don't wake up every morning. Excuse me. Right. No, you're right, but here's what I can say, though. I do know that there are some African Americans of the minorities that I've met that, for whatever reason, whatever happened to be the uniqueness of their background, they aren't preoccupied with their ethnicity. They aren't preoccupied with their racial or cultural identity. And it's interesting to see how they traverse life. It's interesting to see how their life and the results that they get compared to those who are deeply steeped and deeply preoccupied with racial and cultural identity. So I think it is a choice. And I do think it's something that we should raise our consciousness about and begin to look at to see perhaps we've bought into something that we shouldn't. Perhaps we're hurting ourselves by continuing to accept it.
I just want to, have you gone through a day in your life in which you have ever not thought about race?
I have actually. Oh, sure. Everybody has those days when everything is just going your way. I've had days when things were just going my way. And no, I didn't think about it. All I knew was that. Yeah, it was. And I can hardly wait for the next one to come along.
Well, let me at this point say that our panelists have been kind enough to say that they will speak informally to any of you who still have questions. I know it's now 8:48, or 8:38 rather, and we must stop the program. I would like to thank Ms. Heather Campion, who works so diligently in making this evening possible and always does such a fine job here at the Kennedy School. And I'm especially grateful to the Black Students Association, and particularly Dion. Dion, will you stand up, please? Who worked so hard to make this evening possible. I would like to thank this audience for being so polite, and I would like to thank our wonderful panelists. You've been very informative and instructive and very kind. Thank you all for coming, and good night. Tomorrow morning at 10:30 in Local Common Room, this topic will be continued with President Rudenstein and Mr. James Hoyt, who is the head of the Office of Affirmative Action at Harvard. Thank you.